So, dear colleagues, I'm very happy to welcome here at our academic, in our academic building in the Faculty of Architecture and Design of the Slovak University of Technology, our honored guest. It's Professor Jasona Pomeroya from Singapore. He's from academic sphere, but also working in cooperation with universities, companies, has his own studio as architect, but I believe that he will be introduced a little bit more deeply by our next guest, who is representing the governmental Deputy Prime Minister Office. I don't know this in English. Yes. Yes. So it's Mr. Martin Hipky, and I will give you the floor now to welcome and introduce us to the lecture. So enjoy it.
Okay, thank you very much. So as already mentioned, my name is Martin Hipky. I'm from the office of Deputy Prime Minister Stefan Holý. And why we are here, I will try to introduce it a little bit. So those who are following some legislation process, hopefully you have noticed that we've passed the construction law through the second reading in Parliament. Does not necessarily mean that you will understand what that really is about. But that construction law is really old, 46 years old, and that has some troubles in itself. For example, most of the cars in the world are younger than 10 years, while the construction law, 46 years old, is really falling apart. The major reason why the change took place was also because the whole construction law was not based on the digitalization. And throughout the promises what government made to his voters, one of the promises was that we will change this very, very, very important law. We split it, the old law into the two sections. One is the urban planning and the second is the construction. Urban planning is what the name is also calling for. It's a planning. It's a thorough process in order to achieve some harmonizing agreement in between parties who has their rights in the place where they are living, while the construction is more of the project with definitive start and definitive end. After falling of the Iron Curtain, where everything was more than less prior that time a directive of one party, the urban planning was mostly neglected, and we didn't really evolve this urban planning to the stage where it could be useful even for a digital using. And while creating a new vision for urban planning in Slovakia, we were also facing a lot of troubles to find right people, right partners, and right companies who will participate on the vision of the law. And throughout that process of finding also some visionary take on why we are doing this urban planning so important for Slovakian country, is that we found out that the cooperation with one of the real visionaries in the world would be of a benefit. And that benefit we would like to also introduce to yourself, just to see where we are heading to with our efforts. So please, Jason, you can introduce yourself, I guess, and please show what you can achieve with the right approach.
Oh, so no pressure. Thank you very, very much for the introduction. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm delighted to have met Dean Gregor. Thank you very much for the kind invitation here. This is my first time in Slovakia. It's my first time in Bratislava. I've already had such a remarkable, warm welcome. And that's not just the warm feeling that I get from the slivovica in my stomach. It is a genuine warm welcome, and I'm greatly honoured and privileged to be here. Allow me to briefly introduce myself and my studio. I'm the founding principal of Pomeroy Studio. We're designers and thought leaders of sustainable built environments. And crudely speaking, we come from a point of view that we believe that gone are the days that there is one individual that holds the black pen and basically dictates what the design should be. We are increasingly looking at more of a total design approach where master planners, landscape architects, interior designers, graphic designers, environmental consultants can work in collaboration with each other. And that ultimately are the disciplines that inform the designs that we do, from the macro scale of smart districts and zero carbon cities all the way through to the micro scale of zero carbon homes. And that sort of work has found its fruition through projects like this on the left-hand side. This is the first carbon negative house in Singapore. It's called Bee House. Many moons ago, I was asked by a corporation in Malaysia to design the first zero carbon house in Asia, but I'll skip that bit because I'll come back to that in a bit. But the person who saw a TV documentary about the creation of this one particular house in Malaysia said, I would like one of those in Singapore. Could you try and create this for me and do it at the same cost as an average house? And that got me thinking about how one should be able to design sustainable design, zero carbon design, that can also be economic design. And so the fruition came in the Bee House project on the left-hand side. Generates more energy than the family can actually consume. It's like a mini power station, if you will. The middle project is Alice in Mediopolis. Mediopolis is a district in Singapore that is focused on media, hence why it's called Mediopolis. And this is a vertical office campus that allows a series of incubation spaces. You know, young tech startups can come together with an idea, they can share those ideas, they can grow their companies, and then they can migrate through the building like a vertical office campus. And arguably, the starting point for me was to actually look at the quads of Cambridge. I studied at Cambridge, therefore it was kind of ingrained in the system to see how we can create a vertical office campus. And then the project on the right-hand side I'll touch on slightly later is the Kalang Alive master plan. So the ability to kind of turn sustainable design from theory into practical solutions is something that we're passionate about. I mean, I would say that 80 to 90% of our projects actually come to fruition. They're not paper exercises. And I guess the idea of being able to translate theory into commercial application could not be done without an evidence-based approach to design. My professorship, my PhD in vertical urbanism is there because I want to know the fact and reason about what we're trying to do, how evidence-based approaches to design can actually create a better built environment for all. And ultimately that led me to founding Pomeroy Academy, which has 6 pillars of research. The first pillar of research is vertical urban theory, the role of sky courts and sky gardens as alternative social spaces for the 21st century. Zero carbon development, you're all too familiar as academics as to what that is. The role of smart and sustainable cities. Interestingly enough, that is the subject of my TV series as well, which is what Martin was referring to earlier. And ultimately, smart cities mean different things to different people. If I was to go to Songdo in Korea and say to a person, what does a smart city mean to you? They'll talk about big tech. They'll think about the technologies that are basically supposedly changing people's lives. But if I was to go to Ahmedabad in India, one of Prime Minister Modi's many smart cities, and if I was to say to the person on the street, what does a smart city mean to you? They'll say, it's running water, it's electricity, it's sanitation. And so as we go around the world, a smart city means different things to different people. And our research has often tried to cut through the noise to find out what the truth behind a smart city is. Precast modular construction, a very popular topic in terms of trying to understand what the kilograms of carbon dioxide per square meter or kilowatt hours of energy per year is within these modular systems, and how we can then start to translate that into larger projects. the role of culture as the fourth pillar of sustainability. I had the privilege of writing a book on culture and innovation in cities a couple of years ago for Routledge, or should I say the World Urban Forum, and Routledge were the publisher. And ultimately, we're increasingly seeing culture being that fourth pillar in our discourse in and around sustainability. And finally, greening the urban habitat. When you think about the trees, the plants outside, each tree and plant will have a different parameter, a different measure in terms of their carbon sequestration, their water retention. They have their own values. And what we can start to do is look at greenery as a metric to try and balance the ecosystems for which we are designing in. So those research pillars then find their 20% of our carbon emissions are being emitted from the built environment. When we think about the cataclysmic effects of half the world's population living in city centres since 2007, which is then going to increase to potentially about 70 to 75% by 2050, we all know the same story. We are heading towards a cataclysmic effect. And what this often means is that our focus when it comes to sustainability often is in and around the socio-economic and the environmental. We know this. But I would argue that we should also consider culture, space, and technology as equally important parameters for our consideration. Now, when I was doing my research into the role of sky courts and sky gardens as alternative social spaces, it came from a point of view of the depleting open spaces that we use to enjoy, that we use to socially interact. I guess when I look around Bratislava and I see the beautiful streets and squares, I do get the sense of space. I don't get the same sense of space when I'm in Hong Kong or in Tokyo. What we're seeing is increasingly these dense urban environments that are needing to find alternative spaces for our own social interaction. And arguably, we are increasingly going into a virtual world as well, whether it's on Zoom calls or if we're sort of beaming live at this point to people's rooms. It highlights the fact that we are looking at alternative spaces for our interaction. And arguably, we cannot have a discourse on social sustainability without a discourse in spatial sustainability. The reason that we're in this room today is because we are having this conversation. And we are having this conversation because we are in space. So a spatial sustainability that allows us to start considering how we can replenish the loss of open space for our own social interaction, which was the root of the research into sky courts and sky gardens. In terms of cultural sustainability, we want to remember who we are and where we're going. We want to be able to remind our children where we come from. And as we increasingly migrate to different regions because of the pressures of war or the pressures of climate change, we need to be tolerant. Think about equality, think about diversity, think about inclusivity, and ensure at the same time that we are respectful of people's cultures. So a cultural sustainability is equally an important thread to support social sustainability. And finally, the technological sustainability. I'm sure most of you here may be still watching Netflix and having Netflix accounts and sort of burning through data like nobody's business. I certainly do in my downtime. But increasingly, we need to bear in mind that the data that we're consuming is also energy. And so how can we also put taps onto the data that we are taking in? And how can we ensure that we are limiting our access to data, but using it wisely? How can we ensure that when we are using data, it is for the betterment of civil society? That means changing mindsets. That means us really re-evaluating the way that we think. And in the context of the built environment, that's what I'd like to do today. These two characters, let's just do this pop quiz. Who's the person on the left-hand side? Any idea? I know it's a pre-Raphaelite painting, but any idea who this is a representation of? Sorry? The clue is in the box, actually. And yes, exactly. Well done. Give the guy a star. Pandora, yes, absolutely. And the person on the right-hand side is Robert Oppenheimer, the guy behind the Manhattan X project. What I find remarkable about Robert Oppenheimer was that he was 36 years old when he was actually leading the Manhattan X project. Now, the reason I've got these two people together is that they both were ultimately in a rather awkward predicament. When, I think it was Zeus gave Pandora the box and basically said, don't open it. But what do you do when somebody tells you not to do something? You tend to go and do the opposite. So, Robert Oppenheimer's Pandora's box moment was the actual H-bomb project, but it wasn't the H-bomb. He was actually looking at that technical brilliance, that scientific brilliance beforehand. He wasn't to know what was going to happen. And what I find remarkable about the interview that he gave to the BBC in the 1954 Reith Lectures was that the interviewer said, yeah, so why did you do it? And the interviewer was very clever. He didn't say, why did you do the H-bomb? Why did you do something that would lead to the H-bomb? He just said, why did you do it? And the response was, when you see something that is technically sweet, you go ahead and do it, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. And that was just this Pandora's box moment. Everyone was like, you do realize that actually what happened afterwards was the creation of the H-bomb. So arguably, when it comes to the built environment, we often face similar cataclysms. And when we are dealing with space, whether it is virtual or physical, we are similarly faced with what Hannah Arendt says are two different types of characters, almost left brain, right brain, almost like a split personality. You've got, on the one hand, animal laborans, the individual who wants to go and get things done. Don't care about the consequences. Get in the game, do it, worry about the consequences later. Not too different to Robert Oppenheimer's approach to think, I've got a technically sweet idea, I'll do it, I'll manage the issues later. Or there's homo faber, the person who thinks and postulates, but will not necessarily get into the game to actually execute. And the impact of this in our built environment is that you've got the paper architecture of homo faber that may stay on paper, may be wonderful thoughts, visions, theories. Or you've got the other side of the built environment, which is the executed, but not necessarily thought through. I guess it's the middle line that we should be trying to strive for. I mean, I don't have all the answers. We try hard to get in the game. We can only but use our best resources, our evidence-based approach to try and find the truth. And the way that we try and do that is by looking at lateral sources of inspiration, sometimes outside of the field of architecture or the built environment, but also the possibilities of reinterpreting past precedents. Let me give you an example here. So the past inspiration for this zero-carbon house prototype on the right-hand side, called the Idea House, was the Kampong House. I was faced with a chance to design what the developer said will be the first zero-carbon house in Asia. The developer and the Ministry of Housing basically said, we need to try and do something that is game-changing. We want to do something that could be a new middle-range housing type that could be modular and sustainable, that can be applied to a housing industry in Malaysia that was rack and ruined. I had to say, look, you do realize that we're not necessarily the first zero-carbon house. You only have to go back to antiquity to realize that actually the Kampong house on the left-hand side would allow me to not need to flick on a light switch or to flick on the air conditioning. Some of the best lessons are actually rooted in the past, but it's important for us to be able to learn those lessons to influence and reinterpret for the present-day designs. So looking at the Kampong tradition, looking at the modularity, looking at how the family home could be expanded in a modular way, looking at the deep overhanging roofs that will provide an opportunity for rainwater runoff, looking at the recyclability of the materials for future uses. All of these went hand in hand with the socio-cultural elements that we found within the spatial planning of the house. If that was the past precedent, the lateral inspiration comes from the automotive industry. I love the fact that once upon a time, many moons ago, not wanting to give away my age, the chairman of Jaguar Cars came to Cambridge to give a lecture, and he basically said, why is it that I can roll a car off a production line with 0 defects, maybe. I mean, when you roll the car off a production line, maybe there might be something wrong when you finally do get behind the steering wheel, but in the eyes of the car manufacturer, you roll a car off a production line with 0 defects. But why can't you do that with the building industry? And so part and parcel of the challenge is often looking at those lateral sources of inspiration to see how we can influence the system. Some of the greatest breakthroughs in cancer research at the moment can actually be found from the engineering industry as opposed to the medical industry. So sometimes we like to look over the garden fence at those lateral sources of inspiration. And to underpin that with an evidence-based approach that may use, for instance, computational fluid dynamics, is a way that we can then start to test and hone those ideas in real time. Ultimately, this is not the will of one individual. It's about the will of having a group of individuals coming together to work in a sustainable fashion. So more often than not, in the unsustainable product is being pulled in different directions. But if we can actually start to align the expectations of the built environment industry and its professionals, we can then hopefully get to a more sustainable product. So what I'd like to do is just run through a few different areas that we're currently involved with: mobility, digital revolution, food, housing, and waste. And at the end of the day, what I'm hoping to highlight here is not this is how it should be. Definitely not. I'm here to basically share some of the processes that we went through to create these products that are hopefully coming to fruition and providing an opportunity for social betterment. But naturally, the only way that we can progress collectively is by having the different parties coming together. So starting with mobility. Globally, traffic congestion index has increased from 1.39 in 2018 to 1.43 in 2021, and increasingly we're seeing our roads still becoming congested. These noxious pollutants, even though they are arteries for our movement and mobility, we cannot help but feel that they are also the cause of our accessibility suffocation. What I'd like to do is first of all take you on a bit of a journey. So we'll start in Singapore with this particular idea. Now, we'll start with the Kallang Alive master plan. This is a 89-hectare mixed-use lifestyle precinct anchored by the Singapore Sports Hub. And I guess, starting with the past inspiration, for us, it was the old Kallang airfield. Once upon a time, when there were biplanes landing in different directions, we could approach an airfield which was effectively a 5-kilometer ring. And this peripheral ring was the site of what became Southeast Asia's jewel of civil aviation, the Kallang Airport. What we wanted to do then is look at the lateral source of inspiration. And the lateral source for us was looking at the Auckland Light Path. The Auckland Light Path was effectively a connector for pedestrian, for cycle, and I couldn't help but be drawn also to the work that was being done by the Barcelona City Council, the municipality, that was looking to try and move cars away from certain blocks to create these superia, these super blocks, these opportunity to seed the street back to the people. And so what that meant was that we wanted to ensure that we can be taking the cars off the street, try to promote a greater public realm that would put the pedestrian first, but we wanted to try and do that through an evidence-based approach so that we could bring the municipality with us in this journey. It was no point me holding a black pen to do a pretty picture to say, well, I think what we'll do is recreate the loop because we think it will look good. We think that we are going to talk about a cultural narrative and re-evoke the sense of the past, but at the same time we wanted to ensure that it actually meant something. So by taking the original model, by looking at the existing space syntax map of how the streets in existence would be working, we wanted to then see how the incorporation of the loop would be able to enhance the mobility through these spaces. And ultimately, the loop would then be the connector to different sports, recreation, and leisure precincts. So allow me to just play this quick video. Oh yeah, please, sorry. Yes, please, thank you. So this was a Singapore government initiative. The Sports Council of Singapore appointed us to effectively create the master plan. And one of the key attributes of the master plan was the mobility. This was a part of the city that just did not have many people wanting to walk or cycle there. Very, very car reliant. What we wanted to do is reincorporate the heritage loop that will map out the original airport precinct. And that will also effectively define the sports, recreation, and leisure element. And this would also be activated by piezoelectric strips that would allow people to generate energy as they're walking or cycling around this loop, which effectively then created a gateway into the precinct. Embarrassing story about the youth park, I've got to say this. When we were sort of speaking to some of the ministers, we were kind of saying, well, there's going to be a youth park. We want to spread the youth park, but they wanted to kind of keep it confined in one location. And that's something that we were having the constant battle with. When you're wanting to cycle, when you're wanting to skate, surely just let them do it wherever they want to. That's the thing that we're still working on them. When they say, oh, we want to do parkour, we want to do free running, let's give them an area. I said, no, they can do it anywhere, surely. This is the aquatic centre and the rowing centre. And we're delighted to be able to use metrics of measuring the energy consumption, the kilograms of carbon dioxide per square metre, and also the water retention of the parks and spaces to try and really push the green agenda. And some of these pavilions are operational zero carbon as well. So, the digital revolution. You are all too familiar with IR 4.0, the fourth industrial revolution. And what I find fascinating about this particular project in Jakarta was that the site was a former brick plant, making lots of red brick for housing stock in and around this part of Jakarta. The industry of Indonesia has historically been more related to manufacturing, but President Jokowi of Indonesia really wants to swing it towards more of a knowledge-based economy. And this particular government-backed developer was very keen to see how they could help in that transition. Now you're probably wondering why on earth is another circular building? It's a roundabout that's being reused. I guess in the past of monumental architecture and urban planning, this roundabout we were really kind of surprised to see. It's effectively a one-way roundabout, and we were thinking, well, what are you putting there? And when we went to the site, we saw that it was actually a very, very large central park, but ultimately it was just a roundabout. What we wanted to try and do is give this a new lease of life and make it a focal point to this transformation from a manufacturing-led economy to a digital-based economy. And I guess the past inspiration for us was looking at the guilds, the medieval guilds, blacksmithing, bakery, silversmithing, these guilds that would protect these crafts and provide a benchmark of what can be done within those particular industries, and hopefully foster more and more craftsmen to actually build a local economy. Now, arguably, we can then take a lateral source of inspiration from Barcelona and the Fab Labs, the ability to look at digital fabrication labs, the ability to kind of think about a digital guild for the 21st century that will actually protect and preserve people's IP, their ideas, their innovations when it comes to hardware and digital software. And ultimately that led to an evidence-based approach to assessing how this could be a smart district by using various different metrics from around the world, which then allowed us to start thinking creatively about what components would go into this smart district that would also be a new digital guild. And eventually, it was all focused in and around this hub, a hub of production, both in terms of energy, in terms of food, and in terms of talent generation as well, because the local university then found this place as a welcome hub for new ideas, new innovations. So President University said, you know what? If you're creating this hub of digital creatives, we want to be part of this journey. We want to be stepping in as part and parcel of that knowledge sharing exercise. And if we are producing more talent that are supported by its own food production and energy production, we're wanting to be part of this story. So kind of in honor of the bricks, we kind of looked at sort of the color palettes of the bricks that were in and around that region. And that's basically on the outside skin of this rotunda, which would effectively provide an environmental buffer to the hot sun from the west. We would then create these naturally ventilated arcade corridors that run on the inside perimeter. And then a series of sky courts and sky gardens would be the alternative social spaces that both the educational community and the startup community can enjoy. And in and around that central hub was effectively an amphitheatre where new product launches could take place, and an opportunity for the sharing of ideas. Now, this walkway basically integrates with the broader master plan, and the buildings that you see on the right-hand side are a series of vertical urban farms. These urban farms are generating enough food production, like leafy vegetables, in particular bok choy and spinach, to feed about 10,000 students. So basically, all of the food demands in terms of leafy vegetables, which actually isn't so much. I mean, when I think about the amount of vegetables that they're eating over there, it's not that much, not that healthy. Basically, the 10,000 would offset the demand of the university. And the solar that's being generated would be completely taking care of the public realm and the vertical urban farm, and the surplus energy of about 24% would then go into supporting the administrative buildings relating to President University. Now I'm on to supply chains, and I'm conscious of the time as well, because I want to also have a nice conversation with your good selves. We're off to Saudi Arabia this time. And curiously, when I look at the import of food into Saudi Arabia, it's not too dissimilar to what we see in Singapore. You're looking at about 85% of the food that's being consumed in Saudi Arabia is actually imported, just like it is in Singapore. And Slovakia. I didn't want to raise that point, but thank you very much. And in Singapore, there is the 30 by 30 policy. The government have basically said by 2030, 30% of the food that is being consumed in Singapore will need to be grown in Singapore. 30% of the energy that is being consumed in Singapore will need to be generated in Singapore. And we thought, well, this is also something that we could be exploring in Saudi Arabia. And what we wanted to do is conceive a floating closed-loop agri-aquaculture system that is, in my view, not rocket science, because these are established technologies that need to be synthesized together. The past inspiration for us was the Mare Mecca, the straits, the seas of Mecca. Effectively, the Red Sea was, and still is, a remarkable conduit for trade and commerce in and around the Gulf Coast. And what we wanted to do is explore this watery terrain as a means of creating these floating pontoons. And the lateral source of inspiration for us was the Lifebuoy. How could we then synthesize two existing technologies, vertical urban farming that would be powered by solar, but generate additional solar that could then be used by the community? So vertical farming, a structure that would be made out of ETFE and bamboo, which has the compressive and tensile strength of steel, the ability to then have this floating pontoon that would harvest the solar energy and effectively create enough food to support 31,250 people. And that's based on a vegetable consumption of about 16 kilograms per person. Again, it's not very much. I mean, hey, look, I'm not a vegetarian, but I'm sure that I could eat more than 16 kilograms per year. But anyway, what's important to note is that this whole food production is effectively about 500 tons of leafy vegetables per year and about 2 megawatt hours of energy in terms of the solar production that can then go and support the existing community. So the idea of these floating life buoys, these floating rings of food and energy production in areas that were able to kind of sustain that would be ideal. Conscious of time, moving on to housing. We are all too aware of the US Federal Reserve raising interest rates. Housing globally has become more expensive, and we cannot escape the fact that when the Federal Reserve starts raising interest rates, it does have a knock-on effect to interest rates locally in different countries and different cities. So here we are going off to Gävle now. Gävle is in Sweden. It's a wonderful place. If you have been to Stockholm and enjoyed the summers or the winters, I do encourage you to go to Gävle as well. An embarrassing fact, when I went to Gävle, before going, I thought I would do a bit of cultural research, and I noticed that there were lots of goats. I mean, just not real goats wandering around the street, but stone goats in the city. And I was just amazed. I'm thinking, am I really going to see all of these goats dotted around the city? And sure enough, they were everywhere. And then one Christmas, there was this straw goat, this giant goat in the middle of the park. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. On the website, I saw that it was burning. And so when speaking to the mayor, I said, it's an absolutely fantastic celebration of your past culture, the heritage of the goat, and you're burning the goat. And the mayor said, that wasn't on purpose. That's called arson. They just set fire to the goat again. And it turns out it was a hobby. Every year somebody tries to hire a particular apartment with a clear view of the park, and they fire a burning arrow and set fire to this goat. So a bit of a faux pas, but I managed to get out of that one. But curiously enough, cultural sensitivity was really key here, because when you're traveling from a hot tropical climate and then you're setting foot in a cold temperate climate, what knowledge can you impart? But this is where you start to really need to understand the local cultural sensitivities, not just in terms of the goat or eating, coffee and cake at 11 o'clock, but also the past architectural practices. So our past inspiration was really looking at the traditional house, the base, the body and head of the existing structures, the internal spatial planning, and how we could reinterpret this for essentially a new type of housing product, a housing product that would step away from the conventional concrete construction to embrace cross-laminated timber construction, and also the ability to start looking at lateral sources of inspiration of other cross-laminated timber structures from around the world, the opportunity to incorporate vertical farming to sustain the local community, and to effectively get to a point where the lateral sources of inspiration and the past sources of inspiration could also help influence the legislation. Now, when we first did the presentation to the local municipality, they were like, there's no way you're going to be bringing your Singapore sky terraces to Gävle because it's too cold. I said, well, have you heard a thing called climate change? It's actually getting quite hot. If you look at your summers, they're getting longer, your winters are getting shorter, the temperatures are increasing. And what you'll find if you do the survey of the people is that they want to spend as much time outside as they want to spend inside. So can we actually get to a point where we negotiate the size of these balconies, these terraces? Can we start thinking about how dynamic they can be? That they might be sealed up in the winter as winter gardens, but they can be opened up fully as verandas in the summer. And so that ability to reinforce those design assertions through daylight analysis, wind analysis, and the ability to start demonstrating a gentle shift towards a new architectural typology was very key. Allow me to play this video, which hopefully will highlight those balconies a bit more. So this is the site of the old candy factory. I'm sure you're familiar with the Lacquerol pastels. Yeah? Oh, so, you know what, when I was growing up, I mean, that was the first thing I'd have when I've got a sore throat. And what I found amazing was to be able to get to this site and think about how we could be preserving some of those narratives. And I'll get to that in a minute. But these are the enclosed winter gardens that can then open up fully in the summertime to create an extended veranda space. The incorporation of vertical urban greenery can also help modulate the outdoor environment, keeping it cool in the summer times. Now, the two blocks then frame the candy factory square. And if you can see the text in the floor, those letters, those words, those are stories from children of the past. And as they grow up, they're basically, obviously, able to recollect their stories of the lacquerol pastel, their memories of the lacquerol candy factory. And those have been etched into the floor as a reminder of this place. Now, it's a 15-story cross-laminated timber construction, bi-generational energy, so there's rooftop and also membrane solar on certain facades. And then at the top there is a Darius wind turbine technology. The cedar and pine timber construction was effectively the cladding, and we reinterpreted the modules of the traditional architecture of the windows to then come up with the fenestration palette. This is currently under construction, and 75% of the building is actually modular construction. Finally, waste. Approximately 3.4 billion single-use face masks are discarded daily due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And I don't know what it was like for yourselves here in Bratislava, but I could not go to a restaurant or a takeaway place without getting flooded with plastic during the height of the pandemic. Everything was wrapped up. And ultimately, this is our return journey to Singapore, by the way, it allowed us to really think about how we can be doing more with the plastic waste that we are seeing. There is a chain of salad shops clearly trying to promote people to eat more salad in Singapore, which is a good thing. And this chain of stores is called Salad Stop. And ultimately, they wanted to see what they can do with all of this excessive plastic. And I guess the past inspiration was to look at Japanese pottery and ceramic and how that can be stitched together to create something beautiful, but also the lateral sources of inspiration in what Adidas are doing with their particular ocean recycled plastic program. And what this meant was creating a mini trash presso. Imagine your typical espresso, but now just add plastic. And ultimately, this device effectively collects the plastic, it's shredded, it's washed, it's then dried, it's then heated, it's then molded, and then it's effectively cut into plastic tiles, which we are currently exploring as both a cladding material and as a structural material. And we are looking to ensure that this gets as a certified new product with the Building Construction Authority. And this is kind of just a rendering of the concept store, which is basically the first embodied carbon zero store in Singapore. And the premise of this, the design guidelines from this, will then inform the other stores to come. So look at it like a Lego kit of parts, where we're using the recycled material as a cladding material, and then hopefully we can start to see the footprint of these stores gradually reduce as they roll out across Asia. What I hope I was able to demonstrate here, and forgive me if I haven't been able to highlight everything in the space of a 40-minute course, is an evidence-based approach. I mean, we don't want to stand here basically saying that we think this looks right, but we want to ensure that it is based on fact and reason. And ultimately, that means thinking about how we can use technology to ensure that we can measure and monitor green performance through an evidence-based approach to design. And arguably, this is something that can be scaled, whether it's in virtual Singapore on the left-hand side or digital Britain on the right-hand side. I mean, I think that the opportunity to capture data and use it sensitively to effectively create a virtual world that you can then use to test and hone products, places and spaces is key to a more sustainable future. Ultimately, what I'm hoping you're able to see is that in order for us to create that sustainable product, you need to have that sustainable process in place. And that means collaboration. This is not the will of one individual just standing here with a clicker. There is a vast team of expertise, and often that expertise is not just in the design industry. It required us to be engaging with academia, whether that's Cambridge University or the University of Technology in Malaysia or King Saud University in Saudi Arabia. It allowed the active participation of policymakers, legislators, state government officials to lean in and hear the words of academia, as well as the voices of civil society who are basically saying, this is what we want from our city. And then when you've got corporations willing to fund research and development, all of a sudden you've got a greater chance of creating a sustainable built environment by the alignment of values. Civil society, state, corporation, and academia coming together through a culture of innovation to push the needle towards a greener future. And ultimately, what I'm hoping to see, and what we're already starting to see, is that this is influencing the way that we are seeing our cities and the expression in the bricks and mortar of our cities. Every era has had its own issues, its own cataclysms, its own political turmoils, and that has inputted and impacted the different types of architecture of the built environment that we see. And arguably, I would say that green innovation will be tomorrow's heritage. So with that, I thank you very much. I'm sorry if I whistled through that incredibly quickly, the 700 million slides or whatever there were there. And I'm more than happy to answer any of your questions. So thank you very much.
Mr. Pomeroy, thank you very much
Nice
for
pleasure.
your very inspirational presentation. And I think now we have a little bit of time to post questions or discuss some of the issues. So if you are willing to ask, just go ahead.
Yeah.
If you are
Well,
so
I'll try my best to answer your questions.
Maybe then I would start with a question about the social dimension in this process of creating things greener or more sustainable, because the end consumer, the inhabitant of the building is the one who is actually very significant for the output
Yes.
of the sustainability. So what approach do you have, or what experiences do you have with the owners, inhabitants?
That's a great question. And I guess the first thing is that it may sound a bit analog, a bit of an analog approach, but it can obviously be digital in the future. But let's just take, for instance, the idea house, the carbon zero prototype that we did in Malaysia. We were all too aware that it would be very easy for the corporation to basically say, we will give you the brief. You just basically ensure that you follow our brief. We want a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom house, 500 square meters, 0 carbon. It has to have this size for the living room, this size for the kitchen, and basically it becomes a very corporate, hard-nosed reality check, which might not necessarily be what the people want. But then again, it's not just about the people, it's also about the academia, it's about the state as well. We wanted to bring everybody together. Excuse me. So what we did, we created this interesting questionnaire based around our 6 pillars. Social, economic, environmental, spatial, cultural, and technological questions, if you will. And within those 6 pillars, they cascaded a series of questions. And the questions that, for instance, might relate to the culture, one of the culture pillars. Now, we were aware that the question that we would ask of a family of 4 might be along the lines of, so tell us about the day in the life of your family. How do you live? And what are your expectations out of your house? But the question to the state might be along the lines of, we recognize that Malaysia is a multicultural society made up of Malays, Chinese, Indians as the predominant racial groups, and then others. And basically, we want to ensure that there is a cultural sensitivity to those groups. But then to the academe, we're having another question relating to how can we start to spatially map the traditional kampong house to measure how people from the past would use the kampong spaces, and how does that influence present-day living? And then the corporation, when it comes to culture, what are the cultural idiosyncrasies that you want to bring through into your marketing collateral that will help you sell this project to a broader audience? Now, those are just 4 typical questions relating to culture to 4 different, very different stakeholders. And under that, there are a whole series of other questions. And ultimately, it was this very roundtable conversation where, first of all, we would have conversations with NGOs, civil society groups, to drill down what their needs were. And then academia, and then corporations, and then the state departments, the agencies. And once we collated all of this data, we could start to sift through, see commonalities. Those commonalities, we could then start to highlight and bring those groups together into a roundtable conversation. Had we brought all of them into the room at the same time, I think it would have been an absolute mess. It was first of all important for us to just test the water very gently, knowing too well that trying to push the needle for a new housing product was going to be quite contentious, especially as there was 50 years of a particular type of housing model. And so once we had managed to find particular patterns, we could then go with confidence to say, do you know what, there is an alignment across these 4 spheres of influence. And so that element of stakeholder engagement was really key. And I wouldn't say that we wanted to try and place too much emphasis on one person. It would have been so easy for the money bags, the corporation who was employing us, to say, listen to us and us only. We basically had to turn around and say, no, this is an R&D prototype, and you do need to listen to the voices of the other 3 spheres of influence. So I hope that answers your question. Hello, how are you?
Thank you for the presentation.
It's a pleasure.
I want to ask that you mentioned the inspiration in the past about the materials, and I want to ask that what materials you use to achieve the zero carbon projects. Maybe the difference between the housing projects or the family house that you present, and between the big projects as the loop or the university.
Very good question. Thank you very much. And your name is?
Yeah, Miroslava.
Sorry?
Miroslava.
First of all, it wasn't the reinterpretation of the materials from the past. It was the reinterpretation of the spaces and the ideas. I would love to be able to use the same types of materials from the past, but technology has moved on. And so that allows us to use those new technologies. But there are certain things that we can still look at. For instance, bamboo as a material that has great compressive and tensile strength equivalent to steel structures. So the ability to start thinking about how bamboo could be used as a long-spanning material to create our enclosures for the vertical farms, for instance, was one. Bizarrely enough, aluminium has a very high recyclable content, and it does have quite a high embodied energy content, but it's a very, very lightweight material. And when you super insulate it in the tropics, it can mean that you can execute very quickly, have a lightness of touch that can be recycled in the future. So we like bamboo. We do like the sensitive use of recycled aluminium. Then obviously when it comes to glass, we want to try and minimize the amount of glass that we use. We often try and go for a ratio of about 30 to 40% glass to solid walls. And basically that glass obviously needs to be super insulated with low E coatings to try and keep the place cool on the inside. When it comes to materials, when I'm in the Middle East, we still like to use adobe mud. The ability to get down and dirty with mud, which has wonderful insulating properties, is great. When I'm then over in Thailand, the ability to try and get glass bottles as a light source, to recycle those Coca-Cola bottles, to embed into adobe mud so that you can then start to create really interesting double curvature forms, as well as getting natural light coming through those glass bottles. So I guess we can be inspired by whatever we can see in that particular area. When I'm in the center of Singapore, unfortunately, all I see is lots of glass and steel. And so I have to then start thinking a bit broader about how we can take recyclable content like plastic and actually use that in a sensitive way for those sort of shop interiors. So I hope that sort of answers your question. It's a pleasure.
I'll try to translate it.
Thank you, sir.
Zdá sa mi, že tie príklady boli z oblasti rozvinutých, v skratke.
He finds it off to him, it seems like that those examples that you use, so they're coming rather from the countries that are more developed.
Ale budúcnosť v podstate je problematická v krajinách menej alebo veľmi málo rozvinutých. Či sa zaoberá aj, či sa ich štúdio zaoberá aj takýmito problematickými oblastiami.
And what he sees is rather more challenging is that to tackle these questions in the countries that are less developed. So the question is that if you're supposed to involved and if you try to explore these questions in less developed countries.
Pretože tam aj tá komunikácia, všetko funguje asi trošku ináč ako všeobecne v rozvinutejších polohách.
And as he is adding that as well as the communication works completely differently if you compare it to more advanced countries.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question. Sorry, what's your name, sir?
Joseph.
Joseph.
He just said fantastic question.
It is.
He just said.
So, so, Joseph, thank you for the question. And whilst I wish I could show you the many projects that we have, we've only got a period of time. But what I love about the work that we do, and I say this because it's a bit of a passion, I love doing what I do, is how do you then start pushing the needle in those places where there is not necessarily the income to allow those projects to succeed. For instance, creating a carbon negative home in Singapore, the B House, was $5,000 per square meter, which is the average cost of construction for a conventional home. It's not cheap. It's still a first world city-state. But what it highlighted to me, that the process that we went through, we could scale this down to create an $80,000 home in the Philippines. And so I guess that line of development is always there. How can we ensure that whatever we do, sustainable design is still economic design? And so the process that we went through on that house in Singapore, which was 2.5 million Singapore dollars, how can that process yield an $80,000 home in the Philippines that can also be zero carbon? And thankfully, that ability to understand the process, the form matching the climate, locally sourced materials, optimizing natural light, natural ventilation, using renewable energies very sparingly, only to offset what you really are consuming, is where we are positioned. And I wish I could show you all of the projects that we're doing in the Philippines or Indonesia that are the affordable side of things. What I wanted to do today is touch on more broad issues that reflect food, mobility, the digital revolution, just as an example, waste as an example. But I'll be more than happy to pass you my card afterwards, and you can go to the website and you can see the work that we're doing in Indonesia for the affordable housing sector, for instance. And that's something that we get great comfort out of, because one of the classic questions is, if you're a sustainable designer, does this mean that it's actually just for the privileged? And I would say no. What we are doing is something that we have done at a particular price per square meter, but we're able to scale and we're able to bring it to markets where affordability and constructability is an issue. Hence why modular construction is increasingly becoming popular in places like Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Philippines, where the labor is not necessarily where it could be, and the housing demand is moving so quickly, we need to go down a modular route to be able to give them the homes that they need. Thank you for the great question, Joseph. Thank you. Any other questions? What's your name? Lenka. Pleased to meet you.
I want to thank you also for the presentation. It was amazing to listening to you. And I want to say last year I did my master project here in this university, in this faculty. And the primary function of my building was vertical farms, reusing rainwater, solar panels, etc. And I don't have any question. It's just I want to share with you. It's nice to see that someone is working real with this. And this was really imaginary project. It will be never be built, but it's really amazing, this topic. I was really interested in this topic, and it's great to know like someone doing this in real world.
You're very, very kind. And had I known, if I had a crystal ball to know that you would be in the audience saying that statement, I would have brought a book called The Sky Court and Sky Garden for you. Maybe next time that I'm in Bratislava. But ultimately, I think that it is, again, it's a passion. I think that when you look at the fact that there's going to be an additional 3 billion people walking the face of the earth by 2050, how are you going to feed them? How are you going to feed the additional 3 billion people? So there's a professor, I don't know whether he's still there at Columbia University, called Dixon Despomier, who calculated that you'd need a surface area the size of Brazil to effectively create a large farm the size of Brazil to feed the additional 3 billion people. Now, we're not going to find another Brazil. If we did, then obviously nobody would win the World Cup other than Brazil. But what I found fascinating was that if you start to think about vertical farms that then look towards retail malls, offices, and larger footprints that are at height, all of a sudden you've got a chance to try and make up that deficit. So I think it is important that we start thinking along the lines of self-sustenance and resilience of our own food consumption, especially when it comes to the supply chain risk that we've seen during the pandemic. So yes, keep on your journey, all I would say, and keep the faith and keep growing if you are growing your own vegetables.
I would have one question. There are a lot of countries, including us at the moment, who are aiming for a digital twin. However, of course, the purpose of what we want to achieve and that might differ from country to country. But can you elaborate a little bit? Why should we, or if should we, aim for such a result like a digital twin?
I guess the issues that we often face in the early part of the presentation is that we can run ahead and do something and build something and then suddenly see the consequences of our actions afterwards. And by that time, it's too late. We think that we have submitted all the information that we can for a particular building. As we're constructing it, we start to see clashes. We start to see issues arising through not necessarily the coordination amongst different agencies or different consultants or different stakeholders. I guess when you've got a digital platform that provides a means of collating the data, synthesizing the data, and then allowing for anything from clash detection to understanding what the impact of your future development is within that neighborhood or district, you can then start to think about the social benefits, the environmental benefits, the economic benefits. And so having a database, a digital twin, a virtual world based on the physical world as a base model, it allows you to then start using that as an effective tool, as a design tool, whether it is a predictive pedestrian theory to see how people are moving through the space, or how planting within that particular area is going to be reducing the carbon emissions or helping reduce the ambient temperatures, or the ability to see how people are using the retail environments and start to consider what types of function can I do to actually enhance the value of this district or neighborhood through the different land uses. And so ultimately, as an organizing tool and the ability to have multiple collaborators to bring that together and use that as a design tool, I think is going to be really important. We certainly see that in in virtual Singapore, in the virtual twin of the overall Singapore city, and Digital Britain as another good example. That is a collaboration between Cambridge University and Mott MacDonald and a whole series of different stakeholders to effectively create a virtual Britain. I hope that answers. I'm exhausted, by the way. Can I just say thank you very much? I mean, it's been a wonderful journey from, first of all, from London to Vienna and now to here, and then I'll be back to Cambridge and then London and then back to Singapore. Needless to say, a return to the world before the pandemic is a welcome return, but I hope you won't mind if I say thank you now, because you've been incredibly patient, and I know that it's probably been a long day for you as well as it has been for me. So I just want to say thank you very much. It's been really wonderful questions that you've asked. Thank you for that engagement.
Thank you very much.
That's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.
I thank also all of you that you came to this. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I think I don't know what your program is, if we now stay maybe 5 minutes, if somebody wants to ask you in private and didn't dare now, so we can do it.
We have a couple of minutes.
For
Definitely.
time. Yeah, so thank you for